And I started thinking about that a lot, and I started thinking about, of course, all the mistakes that were made, all of the dumb decisions that were made growing up, and the things that I could have avoided. And it was a really interesting question, and it prompted a very strange conversation between me and my younger brother, and all of the past times that we've gotten in trouble started to resurface, and some of them were funny and some of them were not so funny. But I remember growing up, we got to go to my grandparents' house, and that was always a really great experience. But as my grandpa began to age a little bit, he developed arthritis in his hand. And I remember that we did some things that we weren't supposed to be doing, and because of that, my grandpa was then forced to enact some disciplinary measures on, me. And I remember he spanked me with his hand, but because he had arthritis, he couldn't swing very hard, and it didn't hurt. And so I remember after he hit me the first time, I looked back and said, that didn't hurt. And for the rest of the week that we were there, I thought that I was getting away with anything that I wanted to do, but I forgot that my dad didn't have arthritis, and when I got back to the house, he made up for all of the spankings that weren't as effective in the week prior to it. In 2 Corinthians right now, we are wrapping it up. We're getting to the very end in chapter 16, and Paul is going to tell them some things that if they had only known, or if they'd only practiced, then they could have saved themselves a lot of heartache, a lot of trouble that they basically did to themselves because of the sin problems that they were struggling with, and because a lot of the issues that they had going on in the church. As uplifting as this lesson, I hope, will be tonight, it's kind of Paul's main conclusion that he draws here in 1 Corinthians, because leading up to this point, he seems to be hammering on every issue that the Corinthians had and every issue that the church had, and so he comes down very hard on them, and even in the second letter has a little bit of that as well. But he gets down to this section, the two verses that I want to focus on, and if you didn't get a handout, they should be on the stool back there if you want to grab it and kind of follow along with the lesson tonight. We're going to focus on verses 13 and 14, which simply says, "Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong, and let all that you do be done in love." So he has, with 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians combined, you have 29 chapters of Paul basically telling this very dysfunctional church all of the things that they need to be doing right and all of the things that they shouldn't be doing. And he gets to this point right here that if they had applied this to their life, if they had applied this in their congregation and in all of the mistakes that they were making, then they could have saved themselves 29 chapters of rebuke from Paul. So with these verses that we're looking at tonight, 13 and 14, you can basically take that verse and then you can flip back through this Corinthian letter and look at all of the ways that if you apply these verses, or these two verses right here, if you applied them to the previous chapters, you can see how that verse would have helped. And so this is a very helpful verse for us as Christians today in the church, that when there's something that we're struggling with, or if there's an issue in the congregation that we're trying to work through, you have two verses right here that are very simple, that are very straightforward, that kind of help us navigate some of these things. So I'm going to break this down because in 13 and 14, as you can see, you have 5 commands there. Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong, and let all you do be done in love. Now it's a verse it's easy to read, and it seems to be pretty straightforward, but when you break down those 5 commands that are there, you see exactly what Paul is talking about, and the words are a little bit different from each other. For instance, that first command there, be watchful. Basically what that means is don't fall asleep. The word there for watchful is also the same word for being sober-minded. Keep alert. Have your mind able to combat all of these struggles and sins that are going on in the world. Remember, the church here at Corinth was in a very sin-saturated society. I mean, they were there in the midst of all of this idolatry and all of this paganism, and they had a lot of pulls from the world, and so of course that ends up slipping into the church, and we've made reference to that several times in the chapters leading up to this one. But he says, be watchful. And when you look at all of the ways that he's wanting them to watch, to be alert, they were basically going through life, the Christian walk, in a stupor. They weren't sober-minded in their own Christian walk. In fact, we see as we work our way down through these commands that they were very prideful in thinking that they had it all together. And you would think that looking at a church like this that had all of these issues, how in the world did they get to a point in their life where they thought, I'm just fine. I'm doing okay. There's nothing that I need to change. There's nothing that I need to fix. In fact, they get to the point where they are now judging the apostles and judging those sent from God and those writing to them the inspired word here. They put themselves above Paul and start to interrogate him. So he says, be watchful. Watch yourself, but also watch others and watch the congregation. So there's a list there that you'll see on the outline of the different things that he wants them to be watchful for. Number one being the most obvious. Be watchful for Satan. You see, Satan is a creature, if you want to call him that, of opportunity. He's looking for that weak link, and he's looking for those Christians that aren't being watchful. He's looking for those that are asleep. It's like a lion walking through a field. If you were in lion country and you decided to take a nap in the grass right there, you're not very protected, and the lion is going to take advantage of that. And Satan works the exact same way. He's looking for those opportunities. If you remember, and I believe it's Matthew chapter 3, when Jesus is going through some of those temptations in his life before he enters into his ministry, it says that Satan, after tempting him in all of those different ways, when he's hungry, when he's tired, when he's at his lowest point, it says in the end that Satan left until a more opportune time. And we see the different opportunities that Satan took, even though a lot of them aren't specifically mentioned, but we can see how Satan tried to attack Jesus all throughout his ministry with the Pharisees. And even with some of his own, you have Judas who ends up betraying Jesus for money. And as Judas gives into that temptation there, but Satan is always looking for those opportunities to target Christians. But he also says, be watchful for temptation. In your Christian walk, there are going to be things that are going to come up because of Satan, but you're going to have those temptations that are going to try and make you stumble and make you slip up. But this idea of temptation is really the idea of thinking ahead. Looking at that temptation and being able to look ahead spiritually as well and seeing, well, how is this going to affect my spiritual life? What is this going to do for me? And Paul is trying to help them be watchful, look ahead, look down the road and see the decisions that you're making. How is that going to affect the family here at Corinth? How is that going to affect your own spiritual life? And even as you go through some of the more graphic sections of this letter, you see that many of those sin problems that they had an effect on their own health. They had disease, they had death, they had plagues, because a lot of those sin problems that they were finding themselves in because they were giving into temptation. And yet they still had this prideful mentality that they weren't doing anything wrong at all. It also says be watchful for apathy. Apathy is one that maybe a lot of us are very familiar with. That's just simply being content with how things are. There's no need to change, everything's fine, and they kind of get into this swing, into this groove, and they decide to just stay there. They're not growing, they're just giving into the temptation of apathy. So watch for apathy and look at the contagious aspects of it. If you have either leaders or groups of people within the church that are very apathetic, they don't want to do anything, they don't want to work, they don't want to help out with any programs or with the congregation there, then it can bring the rest of the congregation down as well. He says, be watchful for false teachers. And this is not the first time that Paul will bring this up. So the Corinthian church here, obviously, they're facing lots of false teaching, both from inside the congregation, but also out in the society. You had several different pagan leaders and all of these people that were pushing false teachings. And of course, the Corinthians, as we'll see, they were not very mature, and they were pretty weak in the faith. And so they ended up adapting a lot of these teachings that came along with them. If you remember in the 2 Timothy, that letter that Paul writes to Timothy as he's this young minister trying to do his best, he warns him several times, but also in chapter 5 and verse 4, about these false teachers that are coming in and the danger of false teaching. Now today when we talk about false teachers, maybe you think of like this villain type person that kind of comes in and he's a little bit shady and something that Robert Nance and the rest of security would be all on top of. But a lot of false teaching comes from you have YouTube and you have Facebook and you have all of these different outlets that faithful Christian people can express their beliefs and spread the truth, but that also gives the same opportunity for false teachers to get up and do the exact same thing. it's very difficult to, what we called in school was throwing out the bones. And that was basically reading a book that had some great principles in it, some great ideas in it, but you had to throw out the bones because it was written by either someone from a denomination or just someone that was not following exactly what Scripture said. And so they would bring up lots of great points and great ideas, but you had to throw out a lot of it because it was simply false teaching. But you have to be watchful for that because sometimes false teachers are very motivational and they're very convincing, and to the point that it sounds good, so we believe that it's good, and before you know it, you're following along with those same things. So you need to be watchful not only for false teachers, but where they present themselves. But then, of course, we have being watchful for the Lord's return. God's coming back. And so as Paul is going through here and reprimanding them and telling them all the ways that they need to change, he's doing it out of love, which he'll bring up at the end of this section here in verse 14. Everything that he's saying is out of love, even though they're difficult things to say. Even though a lot of even the way that he brings them up are so uncomfortable. And when I started reading through this letter here and started thinking about doing a sermon series all the way through the book, I got to some sections in here I was like, this is going to be so uncomfortable to teach. But Paul knew that the importance of doing this is because one day the judgment is going to happen. One day God is going to come back, and out of love for this congregation that were living in sin, he decided to step up and say something about it. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 42 talks about the Lord's return as well as many other passages in the New Testament. But this idea of being ready and watching for the Lord, I used to think, because it says, God is not going to come when anybody expects it. And so I kind of had this idea in my head that, well, if I'm just expecting God to come every day, then he's just not going to come while I'm alive. But this idea of going outside and looking up in the sky and seeing, well, Jesus is not coming back, so I guess we're good today, is not what he's talking about. This idea of being watchful is keeping an inward eye on yourself. It's not mainly looking outside or looking up at the sky, but it's watching your own problems and watching your own self, and then he'll build on that with these other commands that he'll bring up here. Be watchful for the Lord's return, and you do that by watching each other and watching yourself. You can see already the different ways that this command right here, be watchful, simply don't fall asleep, be sober-minded, keep alert. If they had done this from the very beginning, they could have avoided a lot of pain and a lot of hurt that they ended up going through because of this. The second command is stand firm in the faith. As God's revelation has no equal. Stand firm in the faith, knowing that those commands that are coming from Paul through God and through Jesus' teaching are the right teachings and they're the right faith. And so Paul spends a lot of time trying to convince these Christians here that he has the credentials and that what he's saying is true and that he is from God. And they had a hard time believing that. And again, pride comes into play there as well. But stand firm in the faith. It's like the idea of taking a stake. Think of like a big railroad stake. And you take it and you slam it into the ground. Maybe you're putting down a tent or whatever, but that stake goes into the ground and it's firm and it keeps whatever you've nailed into the ground in a firm position. I would put together, it was I forget what you call it now. I'm not really good at weddings or wedding talk, but it's the thing that you stand underneath. Barber. Okay. And so I had to put one of those together if we're in the front yard so that me and Janelle could get married underneath it. And I put it together. I thought it looked pretty good. And when I walked outside after it had been standing for a few hours, the wind had blown it down. And it was a disaster. I knew that Janelle was going to pull up at any moment, and she was going to see this thing all out in the front yard, and then she was going to call off the wedding, and then I wouldn't get married, and it was going to be a disaster. So, of course, anxiety kicks in and all that. But found some stakes in the garage. Walked in there, found some big stakes, and we ended up hammering that thing down, and it never moved, and it never budged, to the point that when it came time to taking it out of the ground, we had to, heave and haul and try everything to try and get it up. That's the idea of here, standing firm in the faith. Be nailed down. Be secure. Stand firm in God's teachings. Realize that they are from God. And when you realize that, stand firm in them. And your commitment to Christ. That was a big deal with these Corinthians. And Paul, again, will talk about that in Philippians 4 and around verse 1, 2, and even following that. It's their commitment. Where is their commitment? Well, clearly their commitment was not to Christ because of the family that they had become at this point. And so their commitment was entirely to themselves. We want to act a certain way because we're committed to our own wants. And really that's a big concept in the Christian walk in general. But moving on down, it said be committed or stand firm in one spirit, in one mind. Of course, one of the big themes that going through 1 Corinthians is this concept of division and how terrible this is for the church and how they were fighting with one another and they were pulling each other apart. So stand firm in one spirit. All of you standing in on God's word, committed to Christ in one spirit. And also in the will of God, determining what the will of God is. And once you find that out as one, stand firm in it and go that direction. Again, we see all the problems that came up when they decided to follow their own will and do what they wanted to do. And then again, you have against Satan mentioned in Ephesians 6. Stand firm against Satan. Be rebellious against Satan. Don't let him take you. Don't let him lead you away like he's already done in several different ways and all of the chapters basically leading up to this point. But then he says something very interesting that I don't know if you found any humor in this at all in reading this, but Paul is talking to a wide variety of people of all different kinds of ages, and he says, act like men. And he throws that out there, and so when I read it, it sort of took me back a little bit because it doesn't seem like something that Paul would say. Act like men. It's very modern. It has we have in America especially, we think of men, and that's kind of how maybe we read this text here as we look at it from, an American perspective. But there's a lot to this, and he's talking about this idea of courage and maturity. Act like men. Stop acting like children. And if you look back again, if you took this verse and went back through all of these chapters, you can see the ways that they were acting like children, to the point that Paul even calls them out on acting like children and needing to grow up. And then you get into 1 Corinthians chapter 13 when he says, when I was a child, I thought as a child and I spoke as a child, but when I became a man. I don't believe that Paul was talking about when he was a physical child and when he was growing up. I believe that Paul was thinking back to the time when he was speaking like a child, when he was acting like a child before he met Christ on the road to Damascus. But when you become a man, you put away these childish things. Be like men. Defend yourself. You think about the courage that is associated with men, and then you think about children and all of the fears that they have. And I don't know what you were afraid of when you were younger. Hopefully you outgrew them. Maybe you didn't. But there's a few that are lingering with me. Classic was scared of the dark. There are times when I'm the last one here and I have to turn off the lights, and sometimes I turn off these lights first, and you have to go back in this closet and turn off the other lights. And when I turn them off and I come out and everything's dark, my head's down and I'm like focused on the door. I'm ready to get out of here. I don't believe in ghosts. I'm not supposed to be scared of the dark, but usually that's associated with children being afraid of the dark. You have to have a nightlight or something. And they're scared of monsters under the bed. There's this ignorance and that comes along with being a child. And so Paul just very bluntly tells them, act like men. Be courageous, be mature, be able to defend yourself. You think about the helplessness that comes along with being a child. And you don't want them to go trick-or-treating by themselves. You don't want them to go out after dark. You don't want them to go out alone. You want them to have a chaperone, because they're not able to defend themselves and to look out for themselves. And they're not able to make the decisions that they have to make on their own. If it was up to them, and honestly, if it was up to maybe even some of us, we'd like to just eat candy and cake for every meal of the day. But when you get older, hopefully, you realize that that's not a very good rounded diet. And so as a man, as a mature adult, you decide to start eating the grosser things on the menu. But the Corinthians, they were acting like these children, and they were saying, we just want candy, we want sweets and all of this stuff, and this is going to be good for us. And so they chased after every want and desire that they had, and they ended up looking just like the church that we read about here. Act like men. Be able to defend yourself. Don't bicker and fight with one another. There's a few arguments that got as heated as the arguments that got with my siblings. And even though we're very close, there were moments when, there were times when we would fight against each other, and sometimes it just got very immature to the point that, we didn't have a good argument, so we just wanted to throw something at each other. Or we just got really, really loud, and we would try and outdo each other in the noise department. And that's how they were bickering with one another. Act like men. They were fighting about everything. Who's the best? Whose spiritual gift is the best? Who's the best leader in the church that we need to follow? And they were doing all of these very childish things when it came to how they associated with one another. But of course, this goes along with be a man in your thinking. Be mature is really the better way to read that. Be mature in your thinking. Be mature in your speaking. And put away those childish things, again, that you read about in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. So as he's walking down, I hope that you can see this. The reason I decided to eventually get this printed off was, actually I couldn't figure out the copier, that was all Janelle. But the reason it's printed off now is so I started looking down through this verse and realizing, this is the heart of 1 Corinthians. It's in the last chapter, and he's telling them all of the things that they should have been doing all along. And so you can see how this applies not only to them, but also when we look at our own lives and those past mistakes. Remember, I opened up with, if you could go back to when you were 6 years old with the knowledge that you have now, how would you do things differently, or what would change? Paul is giving them this opportunity now to change. And he's, be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, and avoid making the same mistakes that you've been making all the way up till now. So you move down through there, it says, be strong. Now this might sound very familiar, similar to the other points that he was trying to make, but this is really the idea of inner strength, the inner strength that you have inside. Not so much, the muscles and being able to pick up, a car, not my car, that doesn't really count, but, a bigger car. It's the strength of the inner man. And you can read about that in Luke chapter 2, verse 40, where it's talking about Jesus and how he grew and how he matured. And it says he grew and became strong in spirit. So he grew physically, but also his inner man grew. And his inner man grew and matured along with everything else. So be strong. How does your inner man become stronger? How do you recognize inner strength? Well, inner strength is the strength that overcomes the flesh and overcomes those desires. Again, looking back at the Corinthians and how they gave into everything that their flesh wanted, to the point that in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, remember we talked about how Paul gets down to basically saying, you're acting like animals. And we're meant to be so much more than that. From the beginning in Genesis chapter 3, from the moment that we were created in the image of God to have a relationship with God, we were separated from all of the animals. But they're acting like animals because they're following their flesh and their instinct. And so Paul reminds them to be strong inwardly, but also recognize your weaknesses. Look inwardly and see, what is your weakness? What is something that you struggle with? Identify it, recognize it, and do something about it. 1 Corinthians 10:12, he says, take heed lest you fall. That whole issue of pride that they had there, what Paul is trying to remind them of is because they're attacking him and saying, we don't need any of this rebuke. This has gone on too long, this is a little bit too harsh, and we think that we're doing just fine. And so Paul, attacks this pride that they had and says, take heed lest you fall. Be watchful of your own pride, and that's going to be eventually your downfall there. And we saw many of the members were suffering from those consequences as well. Inner strength also involves humility. 1 Corinthians 5:7. What do you have that you did not receive? What makes you unique? And Paul makes the point, it's God. Everything that you have, everything that you've acquired in life, all comes from God. Well, of course, the Corinthians had enough pride and ego, and they were puffed up enough, which is a key word through this book, is they were thinking that they were special and they were set apart. For instance, they would use the argument towards Paul by trying to talk about all of the acceptance that they have in that church and all of the love that they have in that church, because they're letting anybody that is wrestling with any kind of sin problem into the assembly. And so they don't see it as an issue that can spread and that can divide the church. They see it as just being loving and accepting. And so Paul says you need to have the inner strength, to have the humility to realize that everything that you have, everything that you are, comes from God. You're not special in that sense. And then he talks about the run ahead. And then 1 Corinthians 9:24, Paul uses a lot of these illustrations talking about running and this race that we have in life. And you might have heard it said it's a marathon, not a sprint. I'm not a runner. I hate to run. Every time I run, I get a stitch in my side and I get like this mucus that starts to build up and I'm breathing really heavy. And then after I get to, about half a mile, I have to lay on the ground and recuperate for a while because that's not what I do. I don't like to run. I don't train to run. And I tried to go on a race one time in Georgia, well, actually in Florida, but it was 7 miles long, and I didn't train for it at all. I signed up for it because I lost a game that we were playing, and I was basically peer pressured into doing it. So I signed up for it, and as it got closer, I started to realize I do not have time to train for this, and that made me even more depressed. So I didn't train at all. And I showed up there, I didn't stretch, I didn't do anything, I didn't hydrate, and so probably about half a mile, or maybe the distance from me to the door back there, my calves started cramping up, and my lungs started tightening, and I thought I was going to die. And so Paul is basically reminding them that, this life is a marathon, and you have to make that run in order to make it to eternity in good standing with God. And so he says, be strong on the inside. Have the discipline to train. Have the discipline to recognize where you're weak, because the run is a long one. But then also with that, it involves submitting to his strength. Be strong inwardly and submit to God's strength. Pride is playing a huge part in here, and so for them to step back and realize that they're wrong and that the things that they have been doing are wrong, they had to be humble about it, and they had to submit to God's strength and God's will and God's way of doing things. Submitting to God can be hard. I mean, it's even hard to submit to others and to recognize when you're wrong. Someone approaches you about something that is brought to your attention, that you've done something, or that it's what you're doing has been wrong. It's very difficult to own up to that. And for some people it's even more difficult, because it's, maybe you have the type of personality where you want to believe that you're always right. And having to submit to anyone, especially God's will, was very difficult for the Corinthian church and many of us today. All of these things, as you read down through the commands so far, all the way up to number 4, be strong, all of them sound almost like a drill sergeant. So you have Paul going through and laying it on them thick about all of the things that they need to change, and then he gets to his main conclusion there, and all of it is stand firm, be strong, act like a man. And so you would see, if he let them go after that, and let them go back into the church and back into the world, and if Paul had stopped right there, he might have produced some very hard Christians. But then he ends by saying this, but let everything you do be done in love. Let all you do be done in love. And this is that softening point. This is the way in which you carry out those commands. In all of those things, acting like men, being firm, being strong, all of those, do it in love. The way that you approach the gospel, the way that you approach the message, his teachings, the rebuking, everything, do it all out of love. And Paul proves his point that everything that he's been telling them has come out of love by bringing that point up. And then you get, of course, that very clear definition of exactly what love is in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and you realize pretty quickly that it all has to do with sacrifice instead of, the giant red hearts and balloons and chocolate and the mushy feeling that you feel inside. Love is a lot more than that. Let everything that you do, as you carry out these things, as you're standing firm and being strong, do it in love. And you can see all of the hatred and the fighting and everything that's been happening in this congregation all the way up to here chapter 16 and even into 2 Corinthians, that what they were doing was not out of love. The way that they were fighting with one another and those sin problems that they had in their life, none of that was out of love. So there's a few ways that this is expressed, and you have, of course, that list there, but it's in your attitude. You can go up to someone and tell them that you love them, but if they can read it all over your face and all over your body language and through your attitude, and it says something entirely different than the words coming out of your mouth, that's not love, and that's not doing it in love. Out here in the South, there's one of my favorite phrases is bless your heart. It just tickles me to death every time someone says that. But many times, bless your heart usually is before they say something not flattering about that person. And that just always cracked me up because, bless his heart, he's just, a young preacher who doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm like, no, I don't feel blessed. My heart definitely does not feel blessed. But, it's through your attitude. Express that love in your attitude and the way that you carry yourself and the way that you talk. Expressing the sacrifice for those in need. Again, they were only looking out for number one and what they wanted and what they thought that they needed. But love is all about that sacrifice. Doing those things that aren't comfortable. Making those visits that maybe aren't that comfortable. having those conversations that aren't that comfortable, and doing it all out of love. You can have a difficult conversation with someone, be absolutely right, and still be wrong, just in the way that you approached it. We talked a little bit about that this morning. But it's expressing that sacrifice for need, but also in the handling of truth. We have something that sets us apart. If we follow the Bible, the commands that God has given us, we have something that sets us apart and adds us to that family of God. Those people that, out in the world that say, you're part of the Church of Christ, so you believe that you're the only ones going to heaven. And for most of us, we think, okay, well, let's talk about that a little bit more. Let's open up, let's see what God has to say about that. And don't just, answer it on the fly. But some people do take this and say, I am the only one going to heaven. We are the only ones going to heaven. And they use that as like this power tool and power move to basically smother other people and to berate them and attack them with it. And your handling of truth, even when you find out something that needs to be corrected within a congregation or with another member, how you approach them and how you go about trying to tackle this issue together has to be handled in love as well. Expressing your patience with one another. I think I've mentioned before that, praying for patience is often a really scary prayer to pray because you never know who might show up in your life that's going to test your patience and make you grow in those areas. But patience has to involve love. We don't want it to seem like we're just tolerating each other. We don't want to make it seem like we're just putting up with one another, which for many of these Corinthians, it seemed to be the case. They were barely keeping it together. And it seemed like, they didn't have a church building, but it's like they got out into the parking lot, and as soon as they got out, it was like, oh, finally, I get to be away from brother or sister so-and-so. And then on their car rides or their donkey rides or walks back to their houses, it's like everything that they're talking about is against the other person or, how terrible this person is. Patience with one another with love. And also expressed in your worship. That one was one that landed very close to home with me just because as you read through some of the issues that they had, it was in regards to aspects of worship and even the Lord's Supper. And they were taking something so holy and so special that God has given us to be able to commune with His Son and to have that relationship with Him. And they were taking that and then they were just getting drunk and they were just eating a bunch. And they turned it into basically this party. They had taken something so special and ruined it. But when you look at the definition of love and when you look at how Paul talks about worship here, we see that love is that sacrifice. It's we're giving up our wants and our needs for God, and we're sacrificing. The word for worship in the New Testament literally means to kiss towards. It's what you are sacrificing to God. And of course you can flip that around and look at what Jesus did for us as the ultimate sacrifice and the ultimate show of love for us. But have it expressed in worship. When the Corinthian church were coming together and they were meeting, worship seemed to be one of the last things on their mind because they had all of these internal arguments and sin problems that were basically poisoning the entire congregation here. Love has to be expressed in worship. It's hard to sing some of the songs that we sing or read some of the scriptures that are being read and sit through some of the classes and not see how important it is to have that love for God in worship. And it's very easy